Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Debbie Hart, the President and CEO of BioNJ, and I'd like to thank you for joining us for this very timely program. Today, our panel of experts will explore critical topics shaping the financial landscape, including M&A collaborations, emerging technologies, attracting funding, and the impact of the IRA. Plus, they'll share insights into the political, potential economic ramifications of the upcoming 2024 election, and surely some of them will be political. So I'm looking forward to that very much so. A special shout out to our really hardworking planning committee, the Finance and Operations Committee at BioNJ, who brought this program forward. It's their creativity that you're going to see on display here today. So thank you also to today's program sponsors in alphabetical order, EY and PricewaterhouseCoopers. We very much appreciate their support. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available tomorrow on bionj.org, so you can feel free to check it out further. We have many in the room today. In fact, more than 250 registered, and so we'll try to get to as many questions as possible at the end of the panel. We'd encourage you to please type your questions for the panelists in the Q&A box. And if we don't get to your question, we will indeed follow up after the program. So with that, we will dive right in and get started, and I will introduce our moderator. So this gentleman is going to introduce the panel, lead today's discussion. I'd ask you to please welcome the President and CEO of Adeso Therapeutics and BioNJ board member, Scott McGaffin. Welcome, Scott. Thank you so much for doing this. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Debbie. It's a pleasure to do this and a pleasure to serve on that Finance and Business Operations Committee. Today, our goal is basic. We want to have a lively discussion among a dynamite group of panelists with expertise in M&A, collaborations and deals, resource allocation, funding trends, and the impact of the upcoming election, as you mentioned, and the geopolitical landscape. So we'll go pretty quickly through the agenda on the front end and get right into questions. I am Scott McGaffin. I have the good fortune to lead a small company called Adeso Therapeutics. We're a private company of 20 of the finest people in the world who are looking for better solutions in immunology and inflammation and bringing those forward to patients. So we share the ideals of BioNJ because we believe that patients can't wait. Today, I'm also representing, as a proud member of the board, the membership committee, for which each of you, as participants in today's webinar, make up the lifeblood of BioNJ, and we're very thankful for that. You make an important component of our ecosystem, and it's through your membership that programs like this, along with our sponsors, EY and PricewaterhouseCoopers, we can bring you such a fine panel. I'm going to introduce the panel myself, and then we'll get right into questions. Joining us from EY Geo Strategic Business Group is Courtney Rickert McCaffrey. Courtney she's a lead analyst in geopolitics at EY. Her knowledge spans market insights and geopolitics corporately, and she's also involved in political risk management within EY and their geostrategic outlook annually. I'd also like to introduce Philip Scalafini. He's a partner at PwC Pharmaceutical and Life Science. He brings forward a deep commercial understanding and experience supporting biopharma and other health companies. He leads a high-performing team through challenging issues across strategy, operations, digital analytics, and compliance. I'd like to introduce Raul Vanderacker, who's with PwC's Pharmaceutical and Life Science Deals Leader. He has vast experience in transactions, deals, M&A, and divestitures. Raul leads his team, which is focused upon biopharma and medtech companies through deals and seamless capture of value during these acquisitions. We are also joined by Keith Gall. He's the Vice President and Assistant Treasurer at Bristol Myers Squibb. Keith has responsibility over capital markets, financial risk management, international treasury, and strategy and operations, as well as debt management. And then finally, our last participant is Patrick Morley. who's the Senior Managing Director in Leerink Partners Equity Capital Markets Group. He advises both private companies like Adiso Therapeutics, as well as public healthcare companies on optimal strategy and tactics to achieve their financing goals. So in the spirit of Alex Trebek, Patrick will get the first daily double in our discussion today. And we'll turn to Patrick first for kind of his general sentiment on today's equity capital markets. And I'd ask Patrick specifically, the last quarter of 2023 provided what we believed was an uptick in the markets, and it propelled optimism into 2024. Do you share in that optimism today, Patrick? And how would you outline the current state of the equity capital markets?
Thanks for the question, Scott, and it's a pleasure to be with everyone this afternoon. So as you point out, we're right now at a very interesting time in the capital markets where we have kind of fresh memories of both extreme ends of the spectrum coming off a couple years during COVID, where there was really an exuberance around biotech and all of the promise there that resulted in a massive inflow of capital and a very robust funding environment. And then subsequently, a pretty severe pullback that gave everyone very fresh reminders of, ultimately the scarcity of available capital and what that can mean in the operating environment. And so entering 2024, as you say, we had seemingly bounced off of what looks like a low in October of last year and really driven, as we look across all the different factors, most prominently by the rate environment and by the Fed, really optimism that rates were going to fall and fall quickly and meaningfully spurred a huge amount of activity in the first quarter. On one hand, I think you could say that was a little bit of opportunism by very agile issuers to capitalize on that moment in the market. But on the other hand, I think I continue to be optimistic that the big picture remains very positive and that rates at some point in the near future are heading south. Whether it ended up not being mid-year, but whether it's the end of the year or exactly how fast they'll fall and at what pace remains to be seen. But I continue to think at a high level, the sector is under-owned by generalists that are going to provide some important capital, and before long, they'll be looking to re-enter. So I do feel very optimistic about the sector, but it is a tricky environment as everyone balances when those dynamics will unfold.
Yeah, thank you. So what are issuers really kind of looking at? We hear a lot of news today about interest rates and inflation rate and things of that level. Do you feel like biopharma is also influenced, Patrick, by issuers and investors monitoring those kind of trends today?
Yeah, I think as we look at what are issuers monitoring, it's mostly investors, and what are investors monitoring, it's mostly the macro and the rate environment, again, which kind of goes to the urgency to be deploying large amounts of capital today as opposed to tomorrow. Certainly the fundamentals, and really over year to date, for example, in our estimation, the large data catalysts and regulatory catalysts have skewed positive among emerging growth biotech. So there is a sense that the sector is doing its part. And then really, as we look at things, there are two main drivers that can kind of recycle capital and provide an infusion to fuel new issuance and allow companies to raise capital. And that's firstly, M&A, and we have seen a reasonable amount of M&A, and importantly, small and mid-cap M&A, where these companies, either private or public, are owned by the sector specialists that are going to recycle that capital into private financings or early stage biotech, as opposed to large scale M&A, which tends to be owned more broadly by more generalists or emerging growth funds that may or may not seek to deploy capital back into the biotech ecosystem. And then lastly, in this, I assume you'll get to later in the discussion, is really the question of timing. Is when do people feel like they'll quote unquote get paid for taking the risk that's inherent in biotech? As you look at this year, you're handicapping when are rates going to fall, how quickly are they going to fall, how does that put to expectations in the market? And then obviously with things like an election looming and late in the year, there's the question of will I be rewarded for being bold right now Or is this something I should wait and look to revisit, for example, in the first quarter of next year? And the flip side of that is that if you try to get too patient or too cute, you may miss out on opportunities to deploy capital at valuations that you may not see in the near future again. And so I think
Yeah.
everyone's just grappling with those different dynamics.
Yeah. There's so many inputs that go into some of these decisions, and then the timing is something that everybody wonders about. Specifically to one thing you alluded to, the M&A landscape, maybe we could turn to Keith and get a little bit of his feeling or have him comment on some of the evolving trends of what they may see at BMS over the next 12 to 18 months. Keith, you guys were busy both with large acquisitions as well as some smaller ones over time. Don't need to speak too much to those, but you guys, BMS has certainly been active in the M&A landscape.
Yeah, we really have, and I certainly think a lot of it dates back to capital structure, similar to what Patrick was mentioning. That as I think about financing M&A, the last couple of years have felt like they've sort of had a central theme. Where 2022 was sort of early on dominated by Russia and Ukraine, and 2023 with the regional banks, but underneath the entire time really has been that story of interest rates and what rates are doing to the markets. And when we think about M&A financing, or in M&A deals in general, we think about it in terms of what's our firepower, what's our capacity to do deals, and what's the shape of the markets. And the markets have really remained in exceptionally good shape. There's just been exceptional demand across the curve, which gives companies the flexibility to use their balance sheet to fund these deals. I mean, someone keep me honest, but I think 2024 is shaping up to be maybe the busiest capital markets year outside the COVID boom. And as it relates to BMS, certainly experiencing that firsthand. We issued $13 billion debt in February to fund two assets that we acquired, Karuna Therapeutics and Raise Bio. The order book of those bond deals grew to $90 billion. That was $6.8 billion oversubscribed. The credit spreads, which is just the risk premium that we have to issue above a treasury, came in near tights. And as I do think issuances will slow down, and that could potentially impact M&A as the market digests some of the supply. I mean, I think it's just a very constructive deal-making environment right now. And the way I think companies like ours are going to think about M&A, using the examples, Karuna, for example, there's a scarcity of certain type of assets. They're in areas of high unmet need, and they need to be completely aligned with the company's strategies. And if it checks all those boxes, I think this industry will continue to be active in that space. Karuna for BMS reestablished our presence in neuroscience, where the lead asset, KarXT, is in late stages. It's got a PDUFA date later this year. We believe it's going to be a strong growth driver for the company. Again, the area of high unmet need, KarXT will be for treatment of schizophrenia. There hasn't been scientific advancement in that space for over 50 years, and it's got future opportunities in Alzheimer's disease, psychosis, and agitation, as well as bipolar. So I think this is the type of transactions that you're going to see companies look for as they seek to replace the lost revenues from patent expirations and either look to bolster a therapeutic area or expand into a new one. I'd assume kind of bolt-on, medium-sized deals is more likely. But again, balance sheets are in really good shape. The capital markets are really constructive. And there's a significant amount of firepower out there for certain larger deals in certain circumstances, assuming the appropriate valuation can be arrived at and the antitrust hurdles can be clear, both of which challenging. But I feel pretty comfortable that the entire landscape is sort of looking at it through this lens, kind of as we move forward.
Thanks, Keith. Roel, as you kind of heard some of the determining factors that went into consideration, at least from Keith's perspective, are there any other factors that you would add or kind of broadly advise your clients on for strategic acquisitions in an M&A?
And Scott, thank you for the question, and thank you for moderating this panel, and thank you to BioNJ for putting this together. Listen, I think as it relates to M&A, a couple thoughts from me, and some of them sort of dovetail with Keith and Patrick's prior remarks, right? So we did a larger study at the beginning of the year to kind of think forward around where we would see M&A levels moving for biopharma into 24. And at the time, we were fairly optimistic that we would see an uptick in activity, right? We predicted 225 billion to 275 billion of M&A from a value perspective and fairly healthy activity levels. And our belief was predicated at the time on the fact that we have, and this stat has been quoted quite extensively, there's somewhere between 175 to 200 billion of currently patented, product revenue that's going LOE by the end of the decade, right? So we basically have large cap pharma having to make moves along the lines of what Keith described just before me in order to address some of those needs, right? And obviously that can be done through, clinical development organically through the portfolio or through M&A, right? But against that backdrop, we were fairly optimistic that we would see upticks in the levels of M&A activity, over the course of 24, right? So where are we now? It's, deep into May. I think we've sort of have seen that expectation that we had pan out in reality, right? Q4 last year was fairly active. As Keith mentioned, some people sort of took a proactive stance there, but we've seen that sort of level of activity clipping along quite nicely over the course of the first quarter. We see it being, fairly broad-based, right? And we see it sort of happening in the zip codes of deal values where Keith and Patrick were kind of expecting those activities to sort of happen, right? So overall, we think that will sort of continue on. Companies will lean into M&A, to address the types of portfolio gaps that they may have. What I will say is that I've seen companies be more disciplined around this, right? Like the phenomenon that we saw in the public markets and around M&A from, the COVID years, FY20, FY21, where we basically had the risk-free rates clipping at zero, and the phenomena around IPO entries and Me Too innovation getting funding. I think those days are closed. I see acquirers being more disciplined around areas where clinical differentiation is key and where they can really drive value and have portfolio fits, right? I think those are the things that Keith was describing in his remarks previously as well. And that's where we see M&A going forward. So overall, I think, Scott, we're very optimistic that the macro backdrop is fairly healthy. The mix of inflation and interest rates is fairly solid. We're seeing the LOEs, looming in the latter half of the decade that people are moving, towards addressing proactively. And if biotech is innovation, we do think that will naturally drive M&A. So overall, we're fairly optimistic, and the year is effectively panning out along the lines that we had expected, Scott.
Thanks, Roel. Yeah, there's no question, and as Keith kind of outlined, they've selected a few different either re-entry points of indications or disease states and or expansion of areas where they already have a dominance. So, Philip, as you think through the challenges of complex drug development, right, and you advise your clients on how to optimize collaboration strategies, joint ventures, licensing, co-development deals, all to offset R&D goals. How do you kind of take that complexity into consideration to identify or guide candidates or companies on candidates for commercialization over time? Any high level and then granular things that you think will evolve in the coming year?
Yeah, no, great question, Scott. And I guess first I'll just echo all the thank yous the other panelists have given here to you and the bio team. And really, thinking about this question, I think we're sort of at an interesting point now where there's a balance. There's some companies partnering on new technologies, new therapeutic areas or kind of sub-TAs within that. And you're looking at, large scale potential, large scale populations and thousands and millions of patients and prescribers to reach, and looking at it saying, we're going to need a big commercial partner, or we don't want to take on that much risk in being able to not just get to market, but be able to commercialize and sell. We're looking at some platforms like ADCs, for example. Some companies are saying, there's going to be a whole bunch of indications and solid and liquid tumors behind this. We want, not just a commercial partner, but an R&D partner to fund so we can fund studies in all these different areas. And it really just becomes a risk-reward balance, right? You're saying the amount of money that I would have to raise and spend to get this exciting technology that has kind of a lot of applications, large populations there, looking at it and saying, yeah, I'm not going to go it alone. I don't have that much. I have other priorities. Or that's just not the risk profile I want for my business. So seeing a lot of partnerships there and collaborations. On the counter side of that, really interesting, seeing more and more smaller biotechs that previously were out licensing or collaboration strategies for R&D and commercial now saying, well, if I have kind of a niche technology or population I'm going after, it's hundreds or thousands of patients, and it's going to be a couple $100,000 or $1 million plus drug. I can probably go it alone, actually. Like I can go out there and find the 50 patients myself. I don't need a partner to do that commercial piece and either keeping current collaborations, but starting to set aside future assets or indications that they'll commercialize themselves. In some cases, pulling back collaborations and saying, we'll build out commercial organizations. And that's a little bit of a new dynamic, right? As we've gotten to this point where the market's become accepting of a couple $100,000, $1 million therapies. And in general, over the last 20, 30 years, we've raised the standard of care in a lot of these bigger therapeutic areas. There's just not a whole lot of Lipitors that are going to treat 80 million patients out there at lower prices. And now we have these higher value assets. It does make it more feasible for a new biotech or company to pop up and say, I'm going to keep some of these assets. So that only works to a point. Just to reiterate the beginning, there are some really big new technologies that have exciting life cycle strategies, big populations, and we continue to see, those collaborations to kind of share the risk and still be able to get those drugs to market.
Yeah, thanks, Philip. Courtney, Philip just referenced the need to go and think globally. For a small company like Adiso, we are squarely in the crosshairs of what he just described. Eventual commercialization means thinking more broadly, looking for a global partner. Yet we know that cross-border deals and the opportunity to get into emerging markets today faces some potential geopolitical tensions. How do you see the next 12 to 24 months shaping up for both large and small companies in what you advise clients on, everything from market opportunity to pricing to just the geopolitical tensions that are existing today?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. It's a good question. Always hard to predict geopolitics, of course. But I'll outline a few things that we're thinking through and that we talk to clients about. So, I mean, one, I just wanted to point out, Patrick mentioned there may be some sort of waiting game around the U.S. election, later this year in terms of timing for certain things. But in terms of kind of cross-border thinking globally, I just want to highlight it's not only the US election this year, we're actually in the midst of what we're calling a global election super cycle. So voters representing 54% of the global population and 60% of global GDP are going to the polls this year or already have done. And so there is a huge amount of kind of policy and regulatory uncertainty, both affecting this sector as well as the global economy more broadly. But then if we think kind of about the geopolitical risk perspective, we have seen, as you kind of highlighted, that there's been some challenges to cross-border deals. And this is really driven by a lot of, heightened geopolitical tensions, trade conflicts, particularly between some of the major economic powers around the world. And what that has done is led to sort of increased scrutiny and some regulatory barriers for cross-border deals. Now, this isn't across the board. It's particularly for potential deals between countries that see themselves as sort of geopolitical rivals or in some sort of geopolitical competition with each other. And it's also specific to sectors or industries or products that governments see as critical for national security or for their strategic competitiveness. So those strategic products. Strategic sectors. That's where we're seeing more kind of scrutiny of cross-border deals or more limitations on them. So of course, there's a lot of attention to some of the advanced digital technologies like semiconductors and things like that, critical infrastructure as well. But increasingly, we're seeing more policymaker and regulatory attention to healthcare biotechnology, med tech, this sector, the life sciences sector, kind of broadly speaking, has clearly emerged as a strategic sector for a lot of governments around the world. So that does create some challenges. I want to highlight, though, that there are opportunities as well. We're seeing, especially in those strategic sectors, that we're seeing more kind of M&A and investment opportunities among markets that are seen as kind of allies or friendly markets to a company's home country government. So I think that kind of narrows maybe the markets of interest or of opportunity, but it does create some opportunities in those markets that maybe weren't there in the past before these kind of geopolitical considerations came in. So we're seeing some of these policies or regulations to de-risk supply chains or de-risk investments, really kind of shifting the opportunities to the markets that your home country government is sort of friendly with or allied with.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think, the ever evolving landscape presents challenges, right? And one of the challenges that every company faces, be it large or medium or small, is funding priorities. And maybe I could go back to Phil and Patrick for their comments on under the understanding of limited capital. And I think that applies to probably everyone in every sector. But what today, amongst what Courtney just kind of alluded to, these unique therapies from different regions throughout the world that could be funded or are drawing certain attraction, and what's attractive to the capital markets today? So maybe we'll start with Patrick, and then commercially, how are new technological platforms evolving in their commercialization? And we'll pivot to Phil for that one. So Patrick?
Well, I think the biggest trend we've seen is certainly as the market's cooled, but still as they've kind of reopened to a degree, has been a focus on later stage assets and some form of meaningful de-risking, as opposed to, the years of funding, at one extreme, very promising platforms without real definition of how they'd be deployed. And so we've really seen the markets move away from that dynamic and focus on more product stories than platforms. And the other dynamic we've seen is probably a swinging of the pendulum away from hyper niche markets that are, small numbers of patients and kind of orphan focused, and kind of a return to focus on some of the bigger opportunities out there, whether it be obesity or some of the cardiometabolic indications that we've seen attract capital that for a long time were not in vogue. So beyond that, we have seen it be relatively balanced in terms of where investors are seeing opportunity, and certainly part of this in the equity markets boils down to valuations as well, where to an extent you have to toggle valuation to attract capital, even for some of the products that may not be center of the fairway as to what investors are looking for.
Bill, how about commercially? What's the attractive future commercially look like for new indications or new technologies?
Yeah, in terms of indication and therapeutic areas, oncology, always a big area of focus, of course. Something like 40% of R&D ends up back in oncology across the different tumor types and populations out there. And it's just obviously a great space for the right assets, where there's still kind of, you can get appropriate pricing, less payer, PBM pressure, and obviously always a growing unmet need there. Immunology continues to be a big focus area, not just big immunology, kind of the anti-TNFs and ILs and all of the world, still focus in there, of course, but also a lot more focus in atopic dermatitis, SLE, smaller, immunological and inflammatory conditions. So definitely a big area in there. A couple other therapeutic areas where we just continue to see a little bit less pricing pressure, ophthalmology, some areas of dermatology, GI have been good spaces for a lot of early stage investment and M&A to pan out. Technology, no surprise, biologics continue to take a lot of the focus. Specialty meds and biologics make up maybe 2% of overall prescriptions, but 50% of spend and growing. So a lot of focus in there, along with CGTs being part of that, cell and gene therapies. I mean, I'd say we continue to see kind of an optimization of some of the maybe quote unquote older tech, but monoclonal antibodies, new uses, new combinations, optimal dosing regimens, shifts from infused to sub-Q and then even getting to orals. A lot of focus still going into bispecific antibodies and some of the newer technology on that side. Within biologics, probably can't end a conversation without saying GLP-1s. So just a ton of activity in-house collaborations in GLP-1 technology, and then probably couldn't avoid an oncology discussion without saying ADCs, the antibody drug conjugates, a lot of focus and effort in there and promise in that space. And then maybe kind of the really cutting edge, still new technologies in cell and gene therapy, adapting some of the mRNA technology that came out of the COVID vaccine wave for new uses, gene therapies within that, and then kind of the last in the innovations, probably gene editing technologies like CRISPR and others, starting to see our first of those products start to come to the market in the US, at least, some more overseas as well.
Thanks. Yeah, technology continues to advance, and sometimes it catches the attention of parties external. Namely, the government took note, and where many of us are familiar with the Inflation Reduction Act, or the IRA, and how it's potentially impacting research and development funding. Drug pricing in our industry is undergoing a amorphous, we'll say, and it makes me wonder, and maybe we could go to Keith for this one. We all understand the challenging attributes of the IRA, or many of us do. Are there any specific provisions that create new opportunities when some of these therapies, like Phil just described, are evolving or emerging that we're overlooking?
Yeah, so I'll keep this relatively high level, and then I'm sure someone else can certainly jump in. But I mean, I think as it relates to IRA, and obviously this is still something that's developing and new, and companies are working their way through it. And every company's in a different situation, but I think many are thinking about it on the drug development side because of how long it takes to bring a drug to market, right? The decisions that companies make today around which kinds of molecules are going to invest in, small molecules, biologics, which have different patent lives, and which indications they're going to try to get approval for. Those are the kinds of things that'll have an impact as it relates to IRA. At BMS, I know, look, we're just going to remain focused on discovering, developing, and delivering innovative medicines to patients. And that fundamentally won't change as a result of this legislation. In terms of the risks, and again, company to company, but the largest one would be, to your point, if pharma companies have to sell their most innovative and effective medicines at prices dictated by the U.S. government, there could be less investment in R&D. Reduced levels of innovation would never be a good thing for patients, but certainly think it remains to be seen on that one. Not speaking for myself, but I just happened to catch a podcast recently. Scott Gottlieb was on it. He was asked a very similar question, and he expressed his concerns around the R&D point that I just made, as well as concern that companies may over prioritize biologics for small molecules because of some of the terms within IRA, which is not going to be a good thing because the small molecules are used to treat specific types of diseases that biologics can't treat or aren't as effective at. So, that's kind of at least high level, kind of how we're thinking. I know we'll probably talk a little bit later on about, some of the steps that companies are taking to kind of address this. But, high level, I think that's how we're looking at IRA's current stance.
Yeah. Thanks, Keith. So we'll interject with a question from our participants here, and maybe I'll go to Rule for this one. Rule, have you guided companies that may have implemented artificial intelligence into their platforms? Is that holding promise in computational biology or predictive analysis? Are companies looking for that from smaller emerging biopharmas, given that there's a large number of AI efforts underway today?
Yeah, Scott, interesting question, and it's a great one. Thank you for posing that. Listen, I think it's certainly widely talked about in our industry in terms of the promise it may hold and what it will actually do for our industry down the line. And I think the jury is not yet out on the precise impacts it will have down the line here. We have people on one side that are saying it will fundamentally sort of change the clinical development paradigm in terms of how much it can speed up development, right? Which we know is one of the biggest expense items in the biopharmaceuticals, income statement at the moment. There's other people that point to, well, let's wait and see what it will really do. So I do think, and I'm going to confess, Scott, that I'm not a Gen AI expert as such, but I think the jury is probably not yet out on it. I'm going to err personally on the side of, I do think it will definitely have a large impact on our industry as we think about this. I mean, if you listen to expert people in our sector, I mean, Keith mentioned a few. I've definitely, there's a lot of equity research out there, particularly as it relates to clinical development, the impacts that, hypercomputing power can bring to computational biology, how we can speed up clinical development, how we can, speed up target identification. I do think it will develop over time and change our industry. And I think it will be for the better. How quick that impact will arrive at the scene, I think it's a little bit of a, to be answered question yet. Like, there's a lot of FED in the public markets about, the stocks that, deem to have that technology embedded and are pushing the boundaries on that. Like, let's wait and see till the first use cases develop and how quick it can arrive at the scene. But I do believe it will have some impact. But there's also, admittedly, people out there that are taking a little bit more cautious of an approach to that.
Yeah. Patrick, would you add to that, or could you add to that? I know you guys look at, technology from across a wide spectrum, both therapeutics as well as digital and AI driven. How are investors reacting to AI platforms for investment?
I think cautiously is kind of the answer, and would echo the rules comments around everyone. I think acknowledges the absolute transformative potential to incorporate AI on a number of fronts, but I think there's also some skepticism and a desire to be patient and see how that plays out a bit before just throwing money at each contender in that arena. So I think it's somewhere in the middle. There's definitely an acknowledgement that it's likely to have a profound impact. The question is just when and in what way. And I don't think an AI technology platform is immune from the dynamic I highlighted previously, where without a specific use case that you can build a model around, it's going to be tough to attract investment there. But as we see more collaborations or more kind of deals that allow people to model it out a little bit more, I suspect we'll see more value ascribed and more investment.
Right. So successes will drive probably more. Sounds as though both investors and current acquirers are taking a longer term vision towards AI, and our industry is really kind of founded on that. Even in a best case, from time to IND approval to from time of IND awarding to drug approval is at least 7 years. So the industry kind of takes a long-term vision innately. What emerging trends, Phil, would you say that biopharma should anticipate that are going to influence commercialization over the longer term? Beyond the IRA, beyond things of that nature, what are the commercial concerns beyond execution, kind of strategy concerns that companies are wrestling with?
Yeah, and maybe not doubling back on the IRA, but I'd start there for a second just to say the legislative and policy outlook, when you start with, the 7 years to get from IND to approval, and that cuts, into your patent life, obviously. The IRA came in and now for most drugs has brought that potential of shortening that, right? I've got 9 years for a small molecule, 13 for a biologic until I'm going to face negotiation. That very much upends how we develop drugs a lot of ways. And if you look at the PD-L1 market, since we have a BMS folk on here, there's 40 plus indications that have been developed for some of those over the last decade or so. Ahead of biosimilars ever launching, and in a previous world, they would have faced IRA negotiations already. Where we're at now, you look at developing an asset today, and you don't have time to get to 40 indications. That you can't keep your biggest indications longer. So I think that idea of having to speed up R&D. We talked about AI and Gen AI may be a part of that, of course, but like assuming IRA stays intact and maybe even expands, you're on the clock much sooner, right? So the speed to market, reorganizing development plans, and some of that will mean taking more risk, right? The old paradigm of development was start with something kind of safer, later line therapy where there's more unmet need, and then get to your bigger populations later. So certainly that has to change the long-term vision of sort of getting to the bigger potential and pulling up time to peak sales, for example. Continued new models I would think about. We're seeing more and more companies now look at these direct to patient models, cutting out some of the middlemen, direct cash prices for patients, cutting out payers and PBMs. Definitely expect to see more and more of that. And then maybe the last thing I'd put in there is, looking at, there's such a high standard of care and lesser unmet needs that clinical trial designs that are just getting for parity and just getting to market, we're seeing less and less of. And me as a commercial guy, working actually a lot more with R&D and medical organizations to say, what is the right development program? What are the right endpoints? Not just to get FDA to give us the stamp of approval, but to have commercial success in the market, right? And that means taking on more risky programs. Pushing the envelope on endpoints and trial designs, pushing the speed, and pushing kind of the risk profile, I think is something that, well, you can look at it as maybe that's a good thing that will come out of IRA and a lot of these changes and disruptions is having to usher in that new era of productivity and pushing the bar farther.
Yeah. So switching from years to months, it's just a few months from now, Courtney, that we're going to have an election here in the United States, and be interested in hearing some of your thoughts around the outlook for November. It's just a handful of months away instead of a few years from now. And what should we be watching?
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. Well, I will say it is still more than 5 months to go until Election Day. So it's getting closer, but it's certainly not here yet. And a lot can happen between now and then. So, I mean, just in terms of an outlook, I certainly don't have a call on how the election will play out. I don't think you should trust anybody at this point who says they know, because there's a lot of uncertainty between now and then. So a few things I do want to highlight, though, and just in terms of how we think about the election or U.S. elections. So one is, historically speaking, presidential elections tend to favor incumbent presidents. So, most times, the last 12 elections with incumbent presidents, the incumbent won 8 times. But of course, this time is a little different because both of the leading party candidates have been president before, obviously one's president right now. But that does change the dynamics a little bit because voters are very familiar with both Biden and Trump. So this is kind of a new situation. So that'll be interesting to see how that plays out. And then the other, sort of main point I wanted to make is that, there's a lot of factors that influence elections, that influence how voters make their decision when they're actually, getting to mark their ballot. But, what we know over the course of, many election cycles here in the US is that a lot of it will come down to voters' perceptions of the economy. So that in those perceptions obviously do include some of the hard data points about, inflation and growth and unemployment and things like that. But perceptions, sort of people's lived experiences matter more than those macro data points. So that's really sort of the main area I would argue to watch in terms of which way the election might go, especially as we get closer to when people will actually be voting. And then, of course, a lot of the U.S. electorate has pretty much made up their minds already. A lot of states, we could pretty much say which way they'll go today. But of course, with the Electoral College, what it means for the presidential election is that it's really going to come down to maybe 6 or 7 swing states and those persuadable or undecided or swing voters within those states. And so that's really where to pay the most attention. And of course, all of that's at the presidential level, but we have a lot of other elections going on too. So, in the Senate and the House, we'll see elections there. They're pretty closely divided in both cases right now in terms of who's in office currently. The sort of consensus among political pundits at this point is that it's easier for the Republicans to win control of the Senate. it's easier for Democrats to win control of the House. So what if that's right, if kind of all the political pundits and forecasts on that are right, what that means is that no matter who's in the White House, we'll have a divided government because Congress will be divided. So that matters in terms of thinking about what legislation is likely to pass. It's obviously much harder to do big pieces of legislation with a divided government. So that's definitely something to keep in mind, which means, of course, there is a lot of uncertainty. And there will be a lot of uncertainty even once we know the result in terms of direction of policy. But it's more likely that we'll see more kind of movement and volatility next year in terms of sort of executive actions, regulations, and sort of the foreign policy space where the president has a bit more say than Congress does.
Yep. Good. Thank you for that. It is unpredictable, obviously. Although, to your point, it'll probably be equally divided government now and in the future. Who kind of leads that is the unpredictable component to it, which leads me to want to ask Phil, is it possible to kind of game or prepare for these unpredictable outcomes and the resulting economic environments from a commercial perspective? And then I'll pivot to that to Keith and say, will there be a difference in your treasury approach dependent on how that turns out from an election standpoint? So first to Phil, can you game scenario a commercial strategy based on an unpredictable outcome?
Yeah, we do. And like any forecasting scenario, we know it's wrong, but trying to understand what are the right kind of theories of the market of how this could end up and what it means for commercial forecasts. So, I'd say in general, we start with the laws and policies that are on the books today and what we know. And every company has their next year forecast and long range plan, and that's our base case. And then for these big macro political and regulatory scenarios, we're looking at maybe 2 or 3 big plus minus scenarios. And I'd say in general, we get more extremes where we do have that potential in years of a unified all branches, Democrat or Republican, just more likely something gets done. Generally make the assumption that the new regulation coming out probably isn't going to be favorable for farmer pricing, costs, et cetera. So you're looking at some downside scenarios. No matter who's sort of got that unified government, and then thinking about there's different ways they go about it, right? So the Democratic-led administration passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which had some benefits for patients in terms of out-of-pocket costs that actually maybe help pharma. But then the big IRA negotiation program, as well as some new rebates that get paid to Medicare for inflation penalties, and you're thinking about continued Democratic-led government, what could come out of that, whether it's unified or Democratic-led. The Republican policies, again, were not favorable in terms of pricing, but there were, during the Trump administration, some of the international reference pricing proposals. We think about, could those get dusted off and come back? And what would that mean for some more significant downsides? We also look at some other factors, like reimportation has always been on the docket, different policies towards biosimilars, for example. So we're looking at those scenarios. And assessing the possibility of, more likelihood if we did end up in a unified government, not in November, but maybe a couple of years after that with the next cycles, or if it is split, what's likely to get through. But again, starting from what's on the books, that's your base plan, and then looking at some key minus type of scenarios.
Perfect. Yeah, that makes sense. How about you, Keith? Will BMS manage your treasury differently based on the outcome of the election, or will you just kind of follow the market?
No, I don't think we will. And I echo a lot of what Phil just said, because it is the same lens that we look through things, just more of a broad base than just the election. I mean, I think probably one of the things that healthcare companies will look at will be to see if the election will influence the Federal Trade Commission's position on deals, and, the regulatory body that reviews business development transactions for potential competitive impacts and antitrust. From the way that we approach things at BMS within Treasury, and I've been here for just over 2 years, and I couldn't be more proud and complimentary of how the various teams coordinate these types of exercises where, our FP&A team, our strategic finance team, treasury, business development, we roll a lot of these various scenarios. It could be something around this. It could be with tax. It could just be, future IRA developments. And we work through a variety of all these different scenarios from a P&L perspective, from a cash flow perspective. We check to see how our capital allocation plan can withstand different events. We learn how durable it is and what levers we can pull to compensate should different events, kind of break away from our base case. And that's including in all directions, including scenarios where growth's above expectations or events that we're thinking for maybe don't have as significant impact. We look at what shape the balance sheet will be in, how we can flex it, and all with the goal of making sure that we can deliver on our long-term objectives, which is of course, bringing transformational medicines to patients. But that's how we approach it. We look through a lot of different lenses. We obviously have our base case, but we prepare for a variety of different events and make sure that we continue moving the business forward, through a variety of these types of circumstances that will arise.
Yeah, that's good. So the gaming scenarios are plenty, and I appreciate Bill, you and Keith both weighing in on that. Let me pivot just a little bit. We kind of spoke to this earlier on the cross-border deals, but the geopolitical tensions that are facing kind of our industry have been exemplified by new role from one of the native sons of New Jersey, John Crowley, stepping into big bio leadership as the CEO. And these geopolitical tensions are present. They're going to need to be managed. So maybe back to Courtney on how she thinks, if at all, these may affect or be planned for by corporations in regard to supply chains, research collaborations, future innovation. How do these geopolitical resulting from an election affect companies both large and small, Courtney?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it certainly does depend, obviously, on the specific company, what their global footprint is, where their supply chains are, things of that nature, what their overall strategy is. But yeah, at a high level, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, we are seeing governments, policymakers in different countries around the world really starting to do more to incentivize or encourage or even mandate greater, supply chain resilience for companies in sort of the biotech sector. And again, this is driven by governments really seeing this sector, broadly speaking, as more strategic to sort of national security and international competitiveness than they did in the past. And I think a lot of that is actually still driven by the experience of the COVID pandemic and a lot of the challenges in supply chains around APIs and medical devices and PPE and all of that. And so with that experience, as well as some of the other disruptions we've seen in the geopolitical environment and the global economy in recent years, this does mean, I think, if we're looking forward, a pretty safe bet to make is that governments will continue to see all of these products as strategic and trying to get companies to kind of reorient supply chains or operations to where either to kind of onshore them or near shore or friend shore them as well. And that friend shoring one is probably a key point here because it is about some countries with which the U.S. or wherever else you're based have lower geopolitical tensions. So I think that's something just to keep in mind as companies sort of think through decisions about maybe new suppliers or new production locations, kind of adding in that geopolitical component when thinking about kind of market entry or market expansion or any sort of M&As or new partnerships that you're developing is going to be really important.
Yeah, I think the balance component of what you just mentioned seems to weigh in. I'll go to a question that came in through the chat. And again, I'll go back to Rule on this one. And that's, Rule, could you speak to M&A collaborations internationally and in this geopolitical environment from the perspective of not only early stage development and research, but later stage as well? And maybe if it's possible to mix in academic collaboration globally. Any thoughts there, Rule, on?
Yeah, I would say, Scott, that some of the remarks that have been made by Courtney and others kind of resonate here. I do think we've seen regulatory bodies in the US looking increasingly to biotech along the lines of the debates we've seen around the tech companies, right? So, CFIUS, a lot of us will have heard about that, has taken a keener interest, in our sector. And I do think that's a trend that's here to stay, right? On the topic of collaborations broadly, and sort of M&A, I do think searching for the areas where, ecosystem building is a topic that we've talked to our clients about a lot. And finding the right capabilities where they may reside in order to progress clinical development and strides in sort of areas of unmet need, that's going to remain important. And ever more important, than it was before, I would say. But balancing that appropriately with some of the concepts that Courtney has been advancing, right? Doing it in countries and with partners that you have a good understanding of, doing due diligence appropriately upfront. I do think that will be the name of the game going forward. There's just increasingly concern around those types of topics from a collaboration perspective, particularly in the context of geopolitical tension that I think is here to stay. So I think a lot of the remarks that have been made here before is kind of what I would say as well, that we would see these types of debates being conducted through that very prism and that lens of making sure it's being done the right way, that we can control kind of our destiny more so than ever. And that we do it in places where we can just be reliant on the fact that our IP rights are being secured. And I think that's a topic that we'll see rising to the top of importance ever more so.
Yeah, thank you. Yep. So I'm going to go back to another question that was came in from the audience and direct it back to Patrick and possibly Keith. And that's, of future investments to be made or leveraged either by public companies or in the future private companies, how do you see the mix between equity and debt being blended in 2024 and potentially 2025? Is there a way to prognosticate against that? I'll start with Patrick. Patrick, you want to speak to equity versus debt in your opinion, and then maybe the same question back to Keith. Well,
I think I'll let Keith weigh in on those who have the luxury of both levers to pull. I would just first highlight that, the overwhelming majority of the emerging growth kind of certainly biotech universe is kind of captive to the equity market. And there are some venture debt solutions that can be deployed to manage that cost of capital on the margin. But by and large, these are going to be beholden to the equity markets, and the cost of capital is going to ebb and flow as the prices do. Certainly for later stage organizations, be it especially commercial and profitable ones, they're certainly going to have an opportunity to tap the debt markets or other funding sources. But my professional focus is on the equity markets, and the vast majority of our equity clients don't have the luxury of being able to fluctuate between those two pools of capital. But I'm certain Keith can apply a different lens there.
Yeah, no, I think that's spot on. I think it'd be very difficult to actually quantify what that breakdown would look like, just given the various different, conditions that certain companies might be in. I know, when you make a decision like that, first it's going to start as to what your optimal capital structure looks like. Second, I think every company looks at it through the lens of debt capacity, right? How much debt can we take on, assuming we bring in, an acquired EBITDA to maintain, a rating that we're comfortable with. And then you can go down the spectrum of sort of interest rate management, right? Obviously, it's more expensive to issue debt in the US, but there's been an incredible amount of reverse Yankee debt where companies are going into the European markets and markets of that nature, to issue bonds there and take advantage of the widening interest rate differentials between those currencies. And then obviously, given that the cost of equity is traditionally higher than the cost of debt, I think companies will really look for ways to use their balance sheet, whether it be suspending share repurchases or things like that with dividends, to potentially not have to go into equities. Again, I think every condition, every circumstance is different. They're happy with where the multiple is. They have a certain ratings target that they don't want to go through. I think they'll probably partner with their rating agencies and do what's called a RES-RAS, which is a rating assessment analysis, and they'll look for certain circumstances where they can use equity or fund it with all debt and go through that exercise. But I think generally, it's tricky to quantify. I know in our space, balance sheets are in really good shape, but the companies do put, a heavy focus on their credit rating. They like very favorable access to capital. So that is balanced against, what other implications using equity, diluting the share count, and increasing your WACC are going to come into play.
Yep.
Scott, if I
Sure.
may take the liberty to add on to that, assuming that's okay. I
Yes.
just double down on this. So when it comes to M&A, I think Keith said it well. I mean, what I would see, right, given the regulatory stance where we see M&A, we see, our expectations, there's a lot of activity yet to come in the 1 to 10 or the 5 to 15 billion kind of enterprise value range. I think those types of transactions are naturally going to rotate more towards debt and cash on hand and not towards equity, right? Because equity, as Keith said, is an expensive currency. Shareholders are focused increasingly so on accretion dilution. So using equity for those types of M&A opportunities, at least, right, it is not the preferred path. So I do think a lot of that's going to pivot towards some mix of incremental debt and cash on hand. The second point I would make, and it's kind of playing off Patrick's comment a little bit, particularly as it relates to kind of biotechs and clinical development and moving things through the clinic, what I have seen increasingly is private equity take an increasing interest in the life sciences industry, right? So some of these private equity, large alternative asset managers have typically shied away from our sector because of the binary risks that it sort of entails on the clinical development cycle. I do think some of these larger asset managers are increasingly looking with, separate sleeves, with separate pools of capital to deploy them into the biopharma ecosystem, right? So for the right sort of pools of capital that are geared towards taking on the risk that biopharma and clinical development entails, we increasingly see those types of private equity players be a solution to large cap biopharma that's increasingly looking at accretion dilution in their P&L, having to advance a book of work through the R&D cycle and being faced with the P&L where, taking drug pricing up is increasingly difficult because of the IRA. Inflation is still not back to kind of the Fed's target rate at 2%. We have global tax rates going up and interest rates have clipped up, right? So private equity with separate sleeves focused on life sciences is increasingly a solution for our sector to kind of advance clinical development. So that's the one thing I wanted to add here as well.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Those are good points. One thing that we recognize, and this question just came in through the chat, is that IP is the lifeblood of our industry. So protection of that IP is near and dear to all of us. Maybe we'll start with Courtney and then pivot over to Keith as well. Any chance of global governments and/or their motivation to harmonize IP protection?
Yeah, I mean, I'll be curious what Keith or others are seeing from their vantage points, but I would say from my vantage point, what we're seeing is the overall geopolitical landscape is not really one of cooperation or convergence right now. So just because of all the tensions among some of the, kind of the big geopolitical actors, we're just not seeing a lot of work on harmonizing, regulations or IP protection more broadly. I mean, beyond this sector, but within this sector as well. And then I guess specifically, I would say in terms of biopharma, what we're seeing is more that because of the strategic nature of this sector and the products in it and the IP around those products, we're actually seeing more governments try to incentivize the creation of IP within their market. So it's kind of, housed there, or that's where its home is, I suppose, because that's seen as a strategic resource in a lot of policymakers' eyes. So I think it's not, we're not seeing any signs of kind of IP harmonization or convergence around those IP protections globally. But Keith or others, I'd be curious if you have a different point of view.
Yeah, I'd maybe actually ask if anyone else has a better purview into that. From my seat, it's not something that I touch on very regularly. Really, not much to add. I think Courtney said it well, but certainly curious if anyone else has any additional thoughts.
Bill, do you have any thoughts? I know you work cross-functionally across many divisions within an organization when you deploy your teams. What role does IP considerations take in protections globally?
Yeah, I guess I'd say, not to rehash Corey's response that I agree with. I think obviously IP still is king, and having that protection for innovative assets is the lifeblood. I think within that, we are seeing maybe a couple of trends, certainly not harmonizing, but maybe optimizing. So like even before the recent challenges in China with data protection and security concerns, we've seen a lot of clients pulling back with their IP protected assets from China for multinationals because their reimbursement system changed. They have this value-based program that's really spread, and it's very hard as a multinational to compete. So we've seen a lot of companies IPO off, sell assets, including their IP, obviously, partner with local companies and transfer tech transfer. But seeing strategies like that to say, I still want to be able to get the value from my IP, but maybe I shouldn't be the one playing in that market. We kind of had the adapting already from Brexit and what happened in EU, and that's kind of managing your pricing. But then we are seeing some new interesting plays with IP in some emerging markets, Asia, Africa, Middle East, where it's using the same IP but creating second brands or emerging market brands to specifically go into those markets at lower price points and being able to do that. And then maybe the last piece I'll put is you're looking at some of the private label type of arrangements that have come up here in the US with CVS announcing the creation of Cordavis and private labeling some assets. They're not taking the IP. The biosimilar or companies still hold the BLA, NDA, but they are creating private labels specifically for those organizations that creates, in fact, favorable economics. So we had CVS and Cordavis first, and then Cigna ESI announced what they're doing in Qualant, and probably just the start of that model. So agree with all of Courtney's points. Not a whole lot harmonizing there, but I think we are seeing some new strategies to optimize the value of the IP you've got.
Yep, thank you. So going back to Patrick, question came through Patrick regarding investment for biotechs and their success or attention gained from traditional venture capital and or versus angel investing or private offices. Are you noticing at Lyric a difference in attraction based on company size, formation, therapeutic areas, anything like that?
Well, we just, in terms of where our firm is focused, tend to be in, I'd say, on the later stage of financing relative to angel investment. But there are a number of family offices that are pretty prominent. Some of them kind of span a family office structure or philanthropic structures and can deploy capital both through grants or investment. So we have seen some groups of that nature that have become active, but I wouldn't say it's supplanted the traditional institutional community that remains the driving force behind innovation. And certainly the venture firms are a big part of that. And I think what we have seen is a proliferation of what I'll call the crossover specialist funds that invest publicly, but also are more and more reaching back and investing as early as Series A's to get a beachhead in some of the more exciting companies that they're seeing in the private landscape. And I think they've also given the management teams and the companies they've invested into more flexibility to remain private rather than forcing an IPO or having a rigid framework around when they need to see an exit or a liquidity event. And part of that's been instilled by that discipline or that flexibility, however you look at it, has been forced on them by a couple really years now of challenging capital markets environment. And I'd say the opposite is also something we're seeing, where some funds that have, their lineage is more on the venture end of the spectrum, raising kind of all-purpose funds and deploying capital into later stage financings than you would traditionally think of them as being active in. And even some special situations in the public markets where a lot of funds have both built in the flexibility and then ultimately deployed capital against that strategy of finding, whether it's fallen angels or just deep value, where they see, for example, a lead program that's had a setback in a stock that's been punished as a result, but potentially a promising second program or significant residual value that's not being recognized immediately in the market. And so we've seen a lot of ventures type funds that have these special purpose vehicles that can be a meaningful part of those public deals as well. So it's certainly not being driven from what we can see by angel investing or individual investing as much as institutional, but we have seen some diversification and some proliferation among those specialist funds that can go earlier in the funding cycle and then support companies just because they've grown to such a scale. Whereas it's not a case where when a company IPOs, because a meaningful part of their ownership is held by these crossover funds, there's not that immediate transfer from venture investors to public investors. There's much more of a longer gray period that companies can exist in.
Yeah, that seems to be exemplified probably by the challenging economic times that we just came out of. I thought it was interesting to see funds like 5 a.m. create a fund like 11 p.m. So any trends there? Should we be on the lookout for that continuing, or will that become more as markets improve? And if things continue, will we see less of it? Is that dependent on redeployment of capital into present holdings?
Well, I would just encourage, well, the advice we give to companies is just keep an open mind as to the source of capital, and your experiences, even as recently as 3, 4, 5 years ago, may not be reflective of some very credible and very deep-pocketed groups that are active in the market today. It's a very dynamic environment on the investor side in terms of individuals moving firms, of these firms raising new funds with different mandates. So it's a very dynamic environment, and even we've seen very credible groups even recently raise new SPAC vehicles, whereas that was a market that a lot of the investment community has moved away from in life sciences. So there's always groups that are looking for value where others don't find it, and that's kind of how they've made their returns historically. And so different vehicles are just an extension of that. And the biotech investment community has always been one that is very open-minded about looking for new places to find value.
Yep. Well, thanks, Patrick. And thanks to everybody. I think we've reached a point where I'm going to hand it back to Debbie. But first, I want to thank the panel for a great discussion. You guys were fantastic, and it was a pleasure to have been a part of it. So thank you all very much. And Debbie, you want to add some comments here at the end?
I would love to, Scott. I can't agree more on your comments to the panel. So Keith, Courtney, Patrick, Philip, and Rule, and Scott, great job moderating. Thank you, thank you, thank you. We really appreciate it. These kinds of sessions are so important to keeping our members up to the minute on what's happening, and you certainly did that in a very big way. So it sounds like, apparently we are going to continue to be in interesting times, whether we like it or not. And so thank you for helping us sort of figure that out. So thank you also to our sponsors, EY and PricewaterhouseCoopers. We very much appreciate your support. Couldn't do what we do without you. Thank you to our awesome BioNJ team, as always, making it happen. If we did not get to your question, we will circle back after the program. And a reminder again that this recording of this sessions will be on our website tomorrow, bionj.org. If you're not a BioNJ member yet, please contact Sherry Hennessy to learn about the many benefits of membership. And we have a busy events program and many other things that we're doing. And if you're not aware, please do take a look at bionj.org again. You will receive an evaluation for today's session via email. We really ask you to consider filling it out. Your feedback is very important to us, and we frequently make changes and updates and take advice from those who take the time to give us some important feedback. So also, if you have ideas for future sessions, please let us know. Again, you are really the source of much of what we do here at BioNJ. So you're an important cog in our very busy wheel. So thanks everyone for joining us this afternoon. I do hope you enjoy the rest of the day, and take care. Thanks again.